Welcome to After the Amen, the Second Look podcast, where we take another look, a deeper dive, into Sunday's message. Is there more we can learn? And how can we put that to work in our daily walk with Christ?
All right, so welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're tackling something a little bit different, a sermon about faith that starts off with something you don't really expect, basketball trivia.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, things like how many championships did Michael Jordan win with the Chicago Bulls, that kind of thing.
I see. So it's trying to grab the listener's attention right from the start.
Exactly. And it makes you think about things that you're a fan of and how much you really know about those things, so it kind of sets the stage.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So where does it go from there?
Well, the sermon takes that idea of being a fan and really contrasts it with what it means to be a true follower, especially when it comes to faith.
So it's getting at that deeper level of engagement, going beyond just surface level enthusiasm.
Yeah, it's pushing you to think about whether you're just cheering from the sidelines or if you're really living out what you believe.
Okay, so what's the core message here? What's the sermon's main point?
Well, the whole thing is really rooted in James 1.22.
Mm-hmm.
But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves.
Right, that's a powerful verse. It's not enough to just know the teachings. You have to actually put them into practice.
And the sermon uses this really cool analogy to illustrate this point about looking in a mirror.
Oh, tell me more about that. I love a good analogy.
So you look in the mirror, you see yourself, your reflection, but then you walk away and you immediately forget what you look like. It's like that with just passively hearing a message.
Right, it goes in one ear and out the other. It doesn't really stick unless you do something with it.
Exactly. And the sermon goes on to outline 3 key differences between fans and followers of Jesus.
Oh, I'm all ears. Lay those on me. What's the first one?
Well, the first one is obedience versus admiration.
Okay.
Fans, they might admire Jesus, like his teachings, maybe even find his miracles fascinating. But followers, they actually strive to live by those teachings.
Even when it's hard.
Yeah, even when it's not easy or convenient.
I can see that. So it's like the difference between admiring a great athlete and actually training like them. You can appreciate their skill, but to really transform, you have to embody that discipline.
That's a perfect analogy. And the sermon actually brings up a quote from John 14.1 where Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commands."
So there's this direct connection between love and action.
Right. It's not just about feelings. It's about what you do. Which makes me wonder, what does obedience really look like in the context of faith?
Well, the sermon kind of gets into that.
Okay, good.
And it makes the point that it's not about just blindly following rules. It's about actually living out your values, the things you believe in, like embodying love and compassion and forgiveness and how you interact with other people.
So it's about striving to be more like Jesus, not just talk the talk, but actually walk the walk.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's the second difference between a fan and a follower?
So the second one, this is a powerful one, is about embracing the cost of discipleship. You see, fans, they just want the perks, the feel-good stuff, maybe sense of community.
Right.
But true followers, they understand that there's a much deeper level of commitment involved.
I'm curious now, what kind of cost are we talking about here?
Well, it's not necessarily about money, although that could be a factor in certain situations. It's more about being willing to sacrifice your own comfort.
Okay.
Your preferences, maybe even your ego sometimes, for something bigger than yourself.
I see. So it's kind of like being a fan of a sports team versus being like a dedicated athlete. One is about enjoyment and the other is all about discipline and perseverance.
That's such a good analogy.
Thanks.
The sermon actually quotes Pastor Herbert Cooper,
Okay.
who sums it up perfectly. He says, "Fans are comfortable, followers are committed. Fans are consumers, followers are contributors."
Wow, that's really powerful because it is so easy to just be a spectator.
It is.
But you grow so much more when you actually step onto the field and you participate.
You do. And this all ties back to a passage in Luke 14.27-28, where Jesus talks about counting the cost of being his disciple.
Right.
And he uses this example of someone building a tower.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't start building that tower without first making sure they have enough resources to finish it.
I see. So it's not a decision you make lightly. You have to be prepared to see it through.
Yeah, following Jesus isn't just a whim. It's this deliberate commitment.
Right. And you have to weigh the costs and the benefits before you jump in.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got obedience versus admiration, embracing the cost. What's a third difference between a fan and a follower?
So the third one builds on this idea of action and commitment. It's about joining the mission versus sitting on the sidelines.
Ooh, I like that. Tell me more about this mission. What does that look like?
Okay, think back to when Jesus called his disciples.
Okay.
They didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for like a detailed plan. They just dropped their nets.
And followed.
And followed him.
It was immediate, right?
He was an immediate and decisive response.
Yeah, they didn't just admire Jesus from afar. They were like, we're in. Let's do this. But what does that look like for us today? I mean, we're not all called to be like fishermen, right?
No, of course not. But the point is that true followers are actively engaged in living out their faith in whatever context they find themselves in.
Okay.
So using your unique gifts and talents and resources to contribute to something larger than yourself.
So it's about translating those beliefs into action, actually making a difference in the world around us.
Exactly. It's about being the hands and feet of Jesus, like you said.
Right.
And the sermon challenges us to ask ourselves, are we content just cheering from the stands, or are we actually willing to step onto that field and become active players in God's work in the world?
That's a huge question to wrestle with. And it makes you think about your level of engagement in all areas of life, not just your faith.
You're absolutely right.
So we've talked about these three key differences: obedience versus admiration, embracing the cost, and joining the mission. But how does all of this apply to our everyday lives?
That's where it gets even more interesting.
I'm ready.
The sermon actually explores how this fan versus follower dynamic plays out in things like our health, our finances, and even our relationships.
Wow, that's what I call a deep dive. All right, so before we get into those examples, let's just recap the three key differences between a fan and a follower.
All right, so we've got obedience versus admiration,
Right.
Embracing the cost of discipleship,
Mhm.
and joining the mission versus sitting on the sideline.
Boom. Okay, so how does this fan versus follower concept apply to something like, let's say, health? Because that seems like kind of a jump. I mean, I love pizza, but I'm not exactly a fan of kale smoothies.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. You see, the sermon makes this point that so many of us are fans of the idea of being healthy.
Yeah, like we admire the people with six-pack abs.
We do.
And their energy level.
We're envious.
But are we actually willing to do what it takes to achieve that?
Exactly. That's the question.
So it's like buying all the workout gear and following all the fitness influencers on social media.
And then never actually making it to the gym.
Right. We're all about the aesthetic, but not the effort.
The sermon actually uses this brilliant analogy. Imagine someone watching a marathon on TV.
Okay.
They're so inspired by the runners.
Right.
But then they never actually lace up their own shoes and go for a run.
I see. So it's like we're all inspired, but we don't take the action.
That's right. It's about bridging that gap.
Between the admiration and the action.
Exactly. We can't just be fans of the outcome. We have to become followers of the process.
The habits, the choices, the things that lead to real change.
You got it. And it's the same with finances, the sermon argues. We might dream of financial freedom.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
But are we actually following a budget? Are we saving our money? Are we making wise investments?
Right. So it's not enough to just be a fan of, like the idea of wealth. We have to actually follow the principles of financial responsibility.
Precisely.
Put it into action, align our actions with our financial goals.
Yes, it's about moving beyond wishful thinking and into intentional action. And this whole fan versus follower dynamic, it plays out in our relationships too.
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, social media is full of picture-perfect couples and families, but behind the scenes, relationships take work.
Oh, they do. The sermon emphasizes this, we might admire the people who have those strong and loving relationships, but are we willing to put in the effort to cultivate those same qualities in our own lives?
So it's not enough to be a fan of, like, the idea of love and connection.
It's not.
We have to be followers of the principles.
Of the principles.
Patience, kindness, forgiveness, selflessness.
Yes, all the hard stuff. It's about moving beyond the superficial and embracing the messiness of it all.
Right, because relationships can be challenging.
They can, but they're also incredibly rewarding.
They are. This whole fan versus follower concept is really eye-opening. It's like, holding a mirror up to our own lives.
It is.
And asking, am I just a spectator? Or am I an active participant?
It's about honest introspection and a willingness to move from passive admiration to active engagement.
So we've talked about how this dynamic plays out in health and finances and relationships. But what does it all mean? What's the big takeaway here?
I think if we connect all these threads together, the sermon is really getting at the importance of aligning our actions with our values, our aspirations.
Closing that gap between what we say we believe and how we actually live.
Exactly. It's a call to authenticity. to living a life that is congruent with our deepest convictions.
To being doers of the word, just like James 1.22 says. But where do we even begin to do that? How do we move from being fans to becoming true followers?
Well, that's a great question, and it's really what the whole sermon is getting at.
It's easy to talk the talk.
Right.
But walking the walk, that's the real challenge.
It is, and the sermon offers some really practical insights on this. It reminds us that this kind of transformation, it doesn't just happen overnight.
Right.
It's a process. It's a journey of continually trying to align your actions with what you believe in.
So it's not about reaching some level of, perfection.
No.
But more about just showing up each day.
It is.
And making that effort.
Yeah.
To live out your beliefs.
Exactly. It's about progress, not perfection.
Okay, I like that. Progress, not perfection. So what are some practical tips for actually making that shift from fan to follower?
Well, one of the big takeaways from the sermon is the power of intentionality.
Okay.
Being mindful of your choices. Yeah. Asking yourself, is this action, does this align with what I believe in? Is this contributing to the life that I want to create?
It's like having a filter for your decisions.
Yeah.
Not being restrictive, but just being more aware of, the impact your choices are having.
That's a great way to put it. Living with purpose.
Yeah, exactly. What else does the sermon suggest?
It also highlights the importance of accountability.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Finding your people, a community, a group of like-minded folks who can support you on this journey.
I think that's so crucial, especially when you're trying to make a big change in your life. It's so easy to just slip back into old patterns, but having people to encourage you and lift you up, that can make a huge difference.
It really can. And the sermon's closing message was really powerful, I thought. It leaves the listener with this image: are you going to stay in the stands, or are you going to pick up your cross and follow Jesus?
Wow, that's a strong image. It really drives home the point that being a true follower of Jesus requires sacrifice.
It does.
Commitment. A willingness to get out of your comfort zone.
It's about answering the call, not just with your words, but with your actions.
Right, with your whole life.
Yeah, your whole life.
Yeah.
And the sermon reminds us this call to action, it's not just for inside a church building.
Right.
It's for every area of your life, your relationships, your work, your community. It's about making a positive difference, being a force for good wherever you go.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm definitely feeling challenged.
Yeah.
But also really inspired.
Good.
To move beyond just admiration and really step into a life of active engagement, to experience the fullness of life that comes from, aligning your actions with what you believe in.
That's beautifully said. And I would encourage our listeners, think about what really resonated with you during this conversation. What area of your life maybe is calling for you to commit a little deeper? Where are you ready to step onto that field?
Become a true follower.
Become a true follower, exactly. And remember, it's not about some big overnight transformation.
Right.
It's about those small, consistent steps in the right direction. It's about the journey.
And who knows? You might surprise yourself.
You might.
With what you're capable of achieving.
You really might.
When you go from being a fan to being a true follower.
Well said.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And until next time, keep striving to live a life of purpose and intentionality.
It is a really good question. It's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, it's one thing to recognize that gap.
Right.
But how do you actually bridge it, to actually make that change?
The sermon offers some practical advice, I think.
Okay, good.
It reminds us that transformation, it doesn't usually happen overnight.
Right. It takes time.
Yeah, it's a process. It's a journey of constantly trying to align your actions with your values.
So it's not about, being perfect.
No.
But it's about constantly showing up and making the effort.
It is.
To live it out.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Okay, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Progress, not perfection. So what are some practical tips that the sermon gives for making that shift from fan to follower?
One of the key takeaways, I think, is the power of being intentional.
Okay.
Really being mindful of the choices you make, thinking about your actions. Does this align with what I believe in? Is this, helping me create the life I want?
So it's about having that filter.
Yes.
But not being restrictive.
Right.
Just being conscious.
Conscious
of the impact of your choices.
That's a great way to put it. Living with a purpose.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So what else?
Accountability.
Oh, yeah. Having people to be accountable to.
Yeah. Finding your people, a community, a group of people who can support you, encourage you.
That is so important because it's so easy, especially when you're trying to change, to fall back into those same old patterns.
It is. And the sermon ends with a really powerful message. It says, are you going to stay up in the stands, or are you going to get down there and pick up your cross and follow Jesus?
That's a pretty powerful image.
It is.
It makes you think about, what it really means to be a follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
That sacrifice, that commitment, that willingness to get uncomfortable.
And it's a call to action.
Absolutely.
Not just in word, but in deed, with your whole life. And not just inside a church building.
Right. It's about taking it out into the world.
Yeah, in your relationships, at your work, in your community.
Yeah.
Making a difference.
Being a force for good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know I'm walking away from this conversation feeling really challenged, but also really inspired.
I'm glad.
It's a challenge to move past just being a fan and step into that active life of engagement.
Yeah.
But also, it's just so inspiring to think about what's possible,
Yeah.
when you really do align your actions with what you believe.
Absolutely. I hope our listeners will walk away thinking about that, like what resonated with them from this conversation.
Yeah.
What area of their life might need a little more commitment.
Yeah, where they can step onto the field.
Yes, exactly. Where they can step onto that field and really make a difference. And remember, it's not about some overnight change. It's about the little steps. It's about the progress, not the perfection. It's about the journey.
And who knows? You might surprise yourself with what you can do when you move from being a fan to being a true follower.
That's a great point.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And until next time, keep striving to live a life of purpose and intentionality.
To listen to this podcast or to the actual sermon referenced, please find us on YouTube at New Hope Baptist Church WV. And be sure to hit that subscribe button. New Hope Baptist Church.
Know, show, grow, and go.